Everyone feared the billionaire's bride. People lowered their eyes when she entered a room. Jobs were lost with a single look. No one dared to question her authority. But what happens when the person everyone ignores finally speaks? What happens when fear meets dignity? And what if the one with nothing to lose becomes the most dangerous person in the room? This is not just a story about power. It's a story about courage, about a woman who was treated as invisible. And the moment she refused to stay silent, would you have the courage to stand your ground if your future was at risk? Would you speak up even if it meant losing everything? Stay until the end, because this story will make you question who truly holds power. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment below. What would you have done in her place?
Everyone feared the billionaire's bride, and they had learned to do so the hard way. In that mansion, fear was not a rumor. It was a routine. Employees avoided eye contact, footsteps slowed when she passed, and silence followed her like a shadow. One wrong word could cost a job. One mistake could end a career. She was not cruel without reason. She was hardened by years of betrayal, manipulation, and a childhood where affection was a currency never freely given. Wealth surrounded her, but trust never did. She had learned early that power was the only language people respected, so she mastered it ruthlessly. To the world, she was untouchable. To herself, she was constantly at war. No one dared challenge her authority, and no one imagined that the collapse of that fear would begin not with confrontation, but with the arrival of a quiet domestic worker. Her name was Elena. She arrived without ceremony, without trembling hands or desperate smiles. She listened more than she spoke. She followed every rule precisely, yet never hurried, never cowered. When the others whispered warnings, "Don't speak unless spoken to, don't meet her eyes, don't breathe too loudly," Elena only nodded, as if acknowledging facts rather than threats. The first crack appeared on a morning like any other. A cup shattered on the marble floor. Not Elena's fault, but hers. The sound echoed sharply, and the staff froze, bracing for the storm. Elena simply stepped forward, knelt, and cleaned the shards with steady hands. No apologies, no excuses. When the billionaire's bride snapped for her to leave it, Elena looked up calmly and said, "Glass cuts deeper when left unattended." It was not defiance. It was not fearlessness. It was something far more unsettling, indifference to intimidation. Days passed, then weeks. Elena absorbed the sharp words without flinching, the cold glances without shrinking, and slowly, the bride noticed something unfamiliar. Her cruelty no longer landed. Power, wielded so expertly for so long, met no resistance and no submission. At night, when the mansion slept, the bride found herself watching Elena from a distance. She saw the scars on her wrists when sleeves slid back, the stiffness in her movements that spoke of old injuries, the discipline of someone who had survived chaos far greater than wealth-fueled tyranny. This woman did not fear losing a job. She had already lost everything that could truly break a person. The realization was intolerable. Fear had always protected her. Fear kept people predictable, controllable, distant. But Elena disrupted the system simply by existing, by proving that survival could forge a strength no amount of money could buy. One evening, the bride finally asked quietly, almost unwillingly, "Why aren't you afraid of me?" Elena paused, then answered with brutal honesty. "Because you are powerful," she said, "but you are not dangerous." The words struck harder than any insult ever had. For the first time in years, the billionaire's bride felt something unfamiliar tightening her chest. Not rage, not superiority, but exposure. Fear had ruled the mansion, but it had also imprisoned its queen. And the walls of that prison were beginning to crack, not under force, but under the steady presence of someone who had learned long ago that true power is not taken, it is endured. And that terrified her more than any rebellion ever could. The new domestic worker arrived unnoticed, almost invisible, like someone the world had been trained to overlook. She had no impressive resume, no connections, and no safety net waiting beyond the gates of the estate. Her clothes were simple, her posture disciplined, her voice low. But her hands told stories her mouth never did. Stories of endless labor, of hunger endured in silence, of resilience forged not by choice, but by necessity. Unlike the others, she wasn't warned enough. The house had rules, unspoken yet absolute. Fear governed everything. Where one walked, how one spoke, even how one breathed. The staff had learned them through losses, jobs gone, reputations ruined, futures quietly erased. But the new worker arrived without the full map of terror. She understood hierarchy, respect, discipline. What she did not understand was submission born from fear. On her first day, the bride entered the room. Conversation died instantly. Movement stopped. Eyes dropped to the floor as if pulled by gravity. The air thickened, heavy with expectation. Everyone knew what to do, everyone except her. The worker did not step back. She did not bow her head or tremble. She straightened slightly, met the bride's gaze without challenge or reverence, and spoke with calm precision. "Good morning, ma'am." Just that. No hesitation, no apology for existing, one human acknowledging another. The effect was immediate. Something fragile shifted in the bride's chest. A sharp, unwelcome disruption. Confusion surfaced first, followed by irritation. The silence stretched too long, the kind of silence that demanded punishment. She searched the worker's face for arrogance, for provocation, for the familiar signs of defiance. She found none. Was this ignorance, or something worse? The bride's lips curved into a restrained, dangerous smile. In her world, everyone broke eventually. Power always revealed itself in time. Fear was patient, and it was thorough. She decided to test her. The days that followed became a quiet trial. Orders changed without warning. Tasks were assigned with impossible deadlines. Mistakes were anticipated, even engineered. Sharp words were delivered with surgical precision, meant to humiliate, to destabilize, to remind the worker of her place. But the worker adapted. She listened, she corrected, she endured. When criticized, she did not shrink. When ignored, she did not beg. When treated unjustly, she absorbed it with a steadiness that unsettled the household. Fear slipped off her like rain off stone. The bride watched closely. This woman did not react as expected. She did not crumble under pressure. She did not trade dignity for safety. Whatever life had done to her before this mansion, it had already tested her far more cruelly. And that was the problem. Fear had always been the bride's greatest weapon, the language everyone understood. Yet here stood someone who spoke a different dialect of survival, one forged long before wealth, power, and threats ever entered the equation. For the first time in years, the bride felt something unfamiliar coil beneath her certainty. Not anger, not superiority, doubt. And in a house built on fear, doubt was far more dangerous than rebellion. The tests began subtly, then cruelly. First came the impossible schedules, tasks layered upon tasks, time compressed until even breathing felt like a delay. Then the public criticism, delivered with surgical precision, sharp enough to humiliate without raising a voice. Cold stares followed, calculated and heavy, meant to remind the domestic worker of how small she was supposed to feel. The bride watched carefully, measuring every reaction, waiting for fear to surface. But it didn't. The domestic worker endured. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had already survived worse. She had known nights without food, mornings without hope, and a life where quitting meant disappearing. Hunger had taught her patience. Loss had taught her silence. Survival had taught her that pain did not always announce itself loudly. Still, endurance was not the same as invulnerability. At night, alone in a narrow room at the edge of the estate, she cried silently into her pillow, careful not to let the sound escape. Her body ached. Her hands trembled. More than once, she sat on the edge of the bed with her uniform folded beside her, considering what it would mean to leave. To walk away before something inside her cracked, yet every morning she returned. She rose before dawn, washed her face, tied her hair, and stepped back into the mansion with steady resolve. Not out of submission, not out of fear, but out of purpose. She refused to let someone else's pain define her dignity. Whatever cruelty the bride carried, it would not be transferred to her soul. That refusal unsettled the bride deeply. Fear was supposed to control people. Fear bent backs, stole voices, demanded obedience. It had never failed her. And yet here was someone who absorbed it without transforming into what fear demanded. The bride began to notice things she hadn't intended to see. The way the worker completed each task with quiet precision, regardless of how it was assigned. The way she spoke respectfully without shrinking. The way her eyes held no resentment, only distance, as if she had learned long ago how to protect the most fragile parts of herself. It was infuriating. Power lost its sharpness when it could not wound. Authority felt hollow when it failed to provoke. And slowly, against her will, the bride felt something shift within her, a pressure she could not name, a mirror she had never asked to face. Because the domestic worker was not defying her, she was surviving her. And for a woman who had built her entire world on fear, that realization was more destabilizing than any open rebellion ever could be. One night, everything cracked. The mansion was quiet, suspended in its usual carefully maintained stillness. The corridors slept. The walls held their breath. But the bride did not. In her private wing, surrounded by silk sheets, rare art, and a silence bought with obscene wealth, rest refused to come. Luxury, once a shield, now felt hollow, an echo chamber for thoughts she had spent years suppressing. Then she heard it. Soft, almost fragile, drifting through the corridor. The domestic worker's voice. She was cleaning late, unaware she was being heard. The song was not joyful. It carried weight, loss, endurance. It was the kind of melody sung by someone who had learned to survive sorrow rather than escape it. The sound pierced something carefully fortified. Before she could stop herself, the bride spoke. Her voice cut through the air, sharper than intended. The song faltered, then stopped. The domestic worker turned, startled but composed, and waited. What followed was not a reprimand, not a command. It was a fracture. Words spilled from the bride in a way they never had before. Unplanned, unpolished, unprotected. She spoke of abandonment dressed in elegance, of parents who taught her early that affection was conditional and fleeting. She spoke of learning, too young, that vulnerability invited destruction, that tenderness was a liability others exploited without mercy. She confessed how fear had become her armor, how control was the only way she knew to stay intact. The domestic worker did not interrupt. She did not lower her gaze. She did not reach out in pity. She simply listened, fully, deliberately, as if the moment deserved her undivided humanity. No fear, no judgment, just presence. The silence that followed was different from the ones the mansion was built upon. It was not heavy with threat, but with truth. In that stillness, the bride understood something terrifying. She had ruled through fear because she had never felt safe enough to be anything else. Every cold stare, every cutting word, every act of domination had been a defense, a desperate attempt to ensure she would never be the one left powerless again. And now, standing in the dim light of the corridor, she faced an unfamiliar reality. Someone saw her broken, not as weakness to exploit, not as a flaw to mock, but as something human. For the first time in her life, fear loosened its grip, not because she commanded it to, but because someone else no longer needed it to survive her. And that terrified her far more than being feared ever had. That night marked the beginning of an irreversible transformation. Fear did not vanish in a dramatic rupture. It loosened slowly, reluctantly, like a grip that had grown tired of clenching. The bride woke the next morning unsettled, not by guilt alone, but by awareness. For the first time in years, she noticed how exhaustion had hollowed her, how vigilance had replaced tenderness, how power, once mistaken for protection, had quietly isolated her from every form of genuine connection. She began to see herself differently, She noticed how often she confused control with strength, how silence had felt safer than honesty, how cruelty had become a reflex rather than a choice. These realizations did not redeem her. They confronted her. And confrontation, she was learning, required far more courage than domination ever had. What unsettled her most, however, was the domestic worker. The woman had nothing to gain. No leverage, no ambition beyond survival and self-respect. And yet, without intention or demand, she had offered something the bride had never truly received. Dignity without condition. Not admiration, not obedience. Just recognition. Human, unnegotiated, undeserved. That gift could not be returned or repaid. It could only be honored. From that moment on, the bride began questioning every belief that had shaped her cruelty. She caught herself before sharp words formed. She allowed silence to be shared rather than imposed. She started listening, not as a tactic, but as an act of humility that felt both terrifying and necessary. The mansion responded before anyone spoke of it aloud. Tension thinned. Footsteps no longer slowed in anticipation. Conversations resumed, cautious at first, then fuller. The air shifted, subtle, undeniable. Authority remained, but it softened. Order remained, but it no longer demanded fear as its currency. And through it all, the domestic worker remained unchanged. She did not seek credit. She did not claim influence. She continued her work with the same quiet discipline, the same steady resolve. She did not allow bitterness to become her identity, nor suffering to define her worth. Her strength was not loud, not visible, but it was immovable. In time, no one could deny the truth. The most powerful shift in that house did not come from wealth, status, or command. It did not come from fear tightening its grip or power asserting itself. It came from a woman society had ignored, a woman who chose dignity over resentment, presence over submission, and humanity over survival at any cost. And in doing so, she changed everything. After that night, the billionaire's bride could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. She began watching the domestic worker not with suspicion, but with a quiet, unsettled curiosity. It was subtle at first, a pause in the corridor, a lingering glance from across the room. How could someone who owned so little walk with such certainty? How could a woman whose life had demanded so much endurance move through the mansion without resentment, without bitterness, as if her dignity were something internal, untouchable? The worker carried herself with a calm that did not ask permission. She spoke when necessary, remained silent when appropriate, and performed her duties with a steadiness that felt deliberate rather than imposed. There was no hunger for approval in her eyes, no hidden rebellion either, just balance. That contrast disturbed the bride more than open defiance ever could. She had built her entire identity on control, on being untouchable, unquestioned, feared. Control had been her armor, her proof of worth, her way of surviving a world that once taught her how disposable she could be. Yet here was a woman who held no authority, commanded no fear, and still possessed something the bride had chased her entire life: inner solidity, strength born from endurance rather than dominance. The realization followed her everywhere, in meetings, in quiet dinners, in sleepless nights beneath silk sheets. If fear was not unbreakable, then what was she truly standing on? If power dissolved the moment it failed to intimidate, had it ever been real at all? For the first time, she did not silence the question. She let it echo. She let it unsettle her. She allowed herself to sit with the discomfort rather than crush it beneath command. And in that space, fragile, unfamiliar, and frightening, something began to take shape. Not certainty, not redemption, but the possibility that power, real power, might look nothing like what she had been taught to believe. And that possibility changed her more than fear ever had. The staff sensed the shift before it was ever spoken aloud. The air in the mansion felt different, lighter, as if something oppressive had been quietly removed. Conversations no longer died when the bride entered a room. Footsteps regained their natural rhythm. Orders, once sharp and unforgiving, were given with clarity instead of threat. Mistakes still mattered, but they were no longer met with merciless punishment. At first, no one trusted it. Some employees exchanged cautious glances, waiting for the familiar storm to return. They had learned through experience that kindness in powerful people was often a pause, not a change. Fear had trained them to brace themselves. But the storm did not come. Instead, the bride changed in quieter ways. She struggled internally, far from watchful eyes. Often she retreated into solitude, pacing private rooms, wrestling with years of conditioning that had taught her authority demanded cruelty. The instinct to dominate still rose within her, sharp and immediate. Restraint did not come naturally. Each measured response, each withheld outburst, felt like walking into battle without armor, vulnerable, exposed. There were moments she failed. Words spoken too harshly, silences used as shields. But now, she noticed them. And noticing she was learning was the first step toward choice. What surprised her most was the response. People did not respect her less. They did not test her authority or take advantage of her restraint. Instead, something unfamiliar grew in the spaces where fear once ruled. Trust. Employees began to speak honestly, to admit errors early, to work with a sense of shared responsibility rather than survival. She watched it unfold with quiet disbelief. Fear had commanded obedience, but it had never inspired loyalty. Cruelty had enforced silence, but it had never earned respect. What she was building now felt fragile, uncertain, and yet far stronger than anything she had enforced before. For the first time, the mansion functioned not as a battlefield, but as a place inhabited by people rather than shadows. And the bride, once convinced that power required hardness, began to understand a truth that unsettled and liberated her all at once. Authority did not weaken when cruelty was removed. It finally became real. One afternoon, pushed by a vulnerability she barely recognized as her own, the bride asked the domestic worker about her past. The question surprised them both. There was no command in her voice, no sharp edge meant to test or dominate. It came out quietly, almost uncertain, as if she were stepping onto unfamiliar ground without knowing whether it would hold. The domestic worker paused, then nodded, as though she had already accepted that some stories did not need permission to exist. Her answer was not dramatic, and that was what made it devastating. She spoke of a childhood defined by instability, homes that were never permanent, adults who disappeared without explanation. She spoke of losing people she loved and learning, too early, that grief rarely waited for readiness. She mentioned doors closed before she ever reached them, opportunities denied not because of ability, but because of where she came from and what she lacked. Her voice remained steady throughout. Then she spoke of something else, a promise. She said there came a moment when she realized pain could become a weapon, one that justified cruelty, bitterness, and harm. And she had made a promise to herself that suffering would never become an excuse to destroy others. The world had already taken enough. She would not help it take more. Strength isn't loud, she said simply. It's the decision to remain human when the world tries to harden you. The words landed with quiet force. They struck deeper than any insult ever could, because they carried no intention to wound. They were not meant for the bride, and yet they found her precisely. In that moment, something long defended collapsed. The bride saw herself with painful clarity. She had allowed her suffering to justify her cruelty. She had turned every abandonment into armor, every betrayal into permission to dominate. Pain, once endured, had become her rationale for inflicting it. And standing before her was a woman who had suffered just as deeply, perhaps more, and had chosen differently. There was no accusation in the worker's gaze, no triumph, just truth, offered without demand. For the first time, the bride understood that her past explained her behavior, but it did not excuse it. And that realization, more than fear or power ever had, began to change who she was becoming. That realization ignited shame, and with it, responsibility. For the first time, the bride did not turn away from her past, or soften it with justification. She confronted it honestly, without excuses. Memories resurfaced that she had long buried beneath power and routine, moments when kindness had been available, when understanding would have cost her nothing, and yet she had chosen fear instead. Not because it was necessary, but because it was familiar. Facing those memories was painful, but it was also freeing. Each recollection stripped away another layer of the story she had told herself, that cruelty had been her only option, that dominance had been her only defense. She began to see the difference between survival and choice, and in that distinction, accountability took root. Change followed quietly. She did not announce it. She did not perform remorse for an audience. Her apologies were personal, measured, and sincere, spoken in private to the people she had wronged. No grand gestures, no public absolution, just responsibility, taken one conversation at a time. Some were met with disbelief, others with cautious relief. All of them mattered. More importantly, she began changing not just her behavior, but her intentions. Orders became requests, corrections became conversations. Power was no longer used to assert superiority, but to protect structure and fairness. Authority remained, but it no longer needed fear to validate it. Throughout all of this, the domestic worker never demanded transformation. She never reminded the bride of her failures, never leveraged her influence, never claimed credit for the shift unfolding around her. She simply remained consistent, steady in her dignity, disciplined in her work, humane in her presence. In doing so, she proved something profound. Change does not require pressure. It does not need force or humiliation or fear. It needs example. And in the quiet space between who the bride had been and who she was becoming, that example became the most powerful guide she had ever known. As weeks passed, the mansion transformed. What had once been a place of silent anxiety became one of cautious hope. The change was not loud or immediate, but it was undeniable. Conversations grew more honest. Voices carried less tension. In small, almost fragile moments, laughter returned. Hesitant at first, then warmer, as if testing whether it was truly safe to exist again. The bride noticed everything. She noticed how people lingered a little longer in shared spaces, how mistakes were admitted without panic, how work was done with care rather than fear. The house no longer functioned on survival alone. It began to breathe. Once defined by intimidation, she now faced the unfamiliar task of redefining herself through integrity. Each day required intention. Each interaction demanded awareness. And what terrified her most was also what healed her most: letting go of control. Without it, she felt exposed, uncertain, human. But she understood now that fear had never protected her. It had only isolated her, building walls so high that even she could not escape them. Control had given her obedience, but it had cost her connection. Authority had kept her safe, but it had left her alone. At the center of that realization stood the domestic worker, not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as a living reminder. She did not seek recognition or influence. She did not change her behavior to match the transformation unfolding around her. She remained exactly who she had always been: steady, dignified, present. Her power was quiet. It did not demand attention. It did not announce itself. It earned respect through character, through consistency, through the simple refusal to become hardened by cruelty. And the bride, watching her move through the mansion with the same calm certainty as always, finally understood a truth that altered her forever. The strongest influence in a room is rarely the loudest. It is the one that remains human when everything else demands hardness. In learning that, she did not lose her power. She finally discovered it. Despite the visible changes, the bride's internal battle intensified. Transformation is never linear, and old instincts do not vanish quietly. They linger in the muscles, in the reflexes, in the voice that rises before reason catches up. There were moments when fear tried to reclaim its throne, sudden surges of anger, flashes of irritation, the instinct to tighten control because it felt safer than compassion. Each instance reminded her that the past she was trying to leave behind had been practiced for decades. It was comfortable, even when it hurt others. One evening, after a business crisis threatened her public image, the old patterns surged fully. Words were sharper than necessary. Orders were clipped, edged with impatience. Staff froze, waiting for the storm they thought was gone. And then it passed. The bride, realizing what she had done, felt the silence pressing down like a weight. It was deafening. Shame settled in immediately. It was no longer theoretical, no longer distant.
It sat beside her as she retreated to her private wing, her body tight with the recognition of her own failure. That night, she sat alone, staring into the quiet luxury around her, and faced a truth she had long evaded. She could either return to who she had always been, untouchable, feared, lonely, or she could finally confront the pain she had spent decades avoiding. Growth, she realized, was not a reward. It was not earned through wealth or control.
It demanded something far harsher. Accountability, even when no one was watching, even when no one applauded, even when the only witness was her own conscience. And in that moment of raw self-confrontation, she understood the cost and the possibility of becoming someone capable of living fully rather than ruling through fear. The next morning, the domestic worker prepared to resign. The outburst from the night before had reopened old wounds she had long kept sealed, memories of powerlessness, of watching her dignity tested and diminished, of enduring harm in silence. She moved through the mansion quietly, methodically, packing her few belongings with the precision of someone who had learned to leave without drawing attention. She was convinced that change was fragile, temporary, and that the cycle of fear and cruelty would inevitably resume. But before she could reach the door, the bride stopped her. There was no command in her tone, no sharpness, no attempt to justify or excuse what had happened. The bride simply spoke, and what followed was a breakdown, not dramatic, not performative, but raw and undeniable. Words tumbled out in an unsteady confession, apologies offered without justification, without blame, without expectation of forgiveness. She acknowledged the harm she had caused, naming it plainly, and asked for nothing in return. The domestic worker listened, her own hands still on the packed suitcase, her body tense but attentive. For the first time, the bride's power did not seek to dominate, control, or repair her image. It existed simply in truth, in the courage to face what she had done and own it fully. That moment became a defining fracture, not because forgiveness was guaranteed, the worker could leave, could reject it, could remain silent, but because responsibility was finally taken. The mansion, once ruled by fear, had witnessed the possibility of something stronger. Accountability unbound by fear or expectation, offered simply because it was right. And in that quiet, decisive space, the invisible walls began to shift once more, not with power, but with the unassuming, transformative weight of honesty. The domestic worker did something unexpected. She stayed, not out of obligation, not because she felt pressured or grateful or indebted. She stayed because she recognized sincerity. She saw a woman willing to confront her own flaws, to face her cruelty without hiding behind excuses or fear. She understood in a way born from lived experience that healing does not erase mistakes. It transforms how we respond to them. It demands presence, accountability, and the quiet courage to try again, day after day. That choice changed everything. The bride, long accustomed to measuring power by obedience and fear, finally understood a truth she had only glimpsed before. Trust is not rebuilt through perfection. It is restored through consistency after failure, through small but deliberate acts that prove one's intentions align with one's words. From that day forward, every decision carried weight. Every conversation, every glance, every instruction became intentional. Power was no longer the goal. Responsibility was. Authority was no longer a shield for solitude. It was a commitment to the people around her. The mansion, once a stage for intimidation, became something unrecognizable, a space for accountability, for growth, for humanity. And at its center, the bride learned what the domestic worker had always known. True influence is not demanded. It is earned, quietly, steadily, through character and choice. As months passed, the bride's transformation reached beyond personal behavior. She began restructuring her household and businesses, placing fairness and respect at the center of every decision. Hierarchies remained, but they no longer relied on fear as their foundation. Employees were granted not only security and clear expectations, but also a voice, a chance to be heard, to contribute, to matter beyond their roles. Mistakes were met with guidance rather than punishment, and accountability was balanced with support. The domestic worker's influence, subtle yet profound, echoed through every change. Policies once designed to enforce obedience were reimagined to value people over fear. The bride, who had once equated control with survival, now equated leadership with responsibility, compassion, and integrity. She no longer sought admiration or deference. She sought impact. Real impact. Change that endured, not because of intimidation, but because it inspired trust and commitment. For the first time, she felt aligned with herself. The hollow rigidity that had defined her existence began to dissolve. The emptiness that had haunted her in the quiet of her private wings and behind her carefully maintained authority was replaced by a sense of earned peace. Hard-won, fragile at first, but undeniable. And in that peace, she discovered a power far greater than fear. The power to transform not only the world around her, but herself. What neither woman realized was how far the ripple had spread. It began subtly. Visitors felt it first, a difference in the air, a change in tone, a steadiness that replaced tension. They remarked on it quietly at first, almost as if noticing it aloud might break the fragile shift. Then the observations grew bolder. Word traveled through social circles and business networks. The mansion's reputation, once synonymous with fear and control, transformed. The woman who had once been feared was now respected, not because she had softened, not because she had relinquished authority, but because she had strengthened in a way that mattered, through integrity, accountability, and a recognition of her own humanity. Strength without cruelty, power balanced with responsibility, influence built on trust rather than intimidation. At the heart of that transformation stood a truth that few were prepared to accept. The most profound revolutions are often sparked not by those with the loudest voices or the greatest wealth, but by those with the least power. The ones who, when faced with injustice or bitterness, choose integrity instead. It was quiet, unassuming, yet unstoppable. The domestic worker had remained steadfast, consistent, and human, and in doing so, had changed not just a house, but a world that had assumed fear was the ultimate currency. The ripple continued, reaching further than either woman could have imagined, proving that real power is not inherited, bought, or demanded. It is earned, it is witnessed. And it begins with a choice: to remain whole, even when the world has long tried to break you. The turning point came when the billionaire's bride faced a public exposure she could not control. A past scandal, long buried under wealth and influence, resurfaced, threatening her reputation, her marriage, and everything she had meticulously built. Old instincts stirred immediately. Fear whispered in her ears, urging her to intimidate, to silence, to crush anyone who dared stand in her way. That was the woman the world expected. Ruthless, untouchable, feared. But something inside her resisted. For the first time, she hesitated, then chose differently. She chose honesty over dominance. She faced the situation openly, acknowledging mistakes without cruelty, without manipulation, without spinning a narrative to save face. She refused to weaponize fear to protect herself. The backlash was swift and brutal. Critics pounced, questioning her sincerity, mocking her vulnerability, predicting her downfall. The headlines were merciless. Business allies whispered doubts. Friends and acquaintances tested her patience. And yet, she stood firm. She stood firm because she understood something she had never allowed herself to see before. Power measured through fear is fragile. True strength emerges in standing by one's integrity when the world expects you to falter. The domestic worker watched quietly, her presence steady and unwavering. She understood the cost of that choice. Growth, she knew, always demands sacrifice. To rise above old patterns, to reject cruelty even when it seems the only shield, requires courage, and it often comes at the expense of influence, favor, and ease. The bride lost influence that day. Doors she once thought permanent shifted. Some alliances dissolved. Her control waned, but what she gained was far more powerful: self-respect. For the first time, she could meet her own gaze without flinching, without armor, without shame. And that, she realized, was the beginning of real freedom. The storm passed slowly, leaving behind both scars and clarity. The mansion, once heavy with tension, breathed differently now. Those who remained around the bride were no longer bound by fear, but by trust. Fragile at first, then growing stronger with each honest interaction. She learned, sometimes painfully, that not everyone would stay. Some would leave, disillusioned or unwilling to adjust. And that was okay. Loyalty born of control had been an illusion. Authenticity, even when it came with absence, offered something real. In private moments, the bride turned to the domestic worker with a quiet, unpracticed sincerity. She thanked her, not with gifts, promotions, or grand gestures, but with words she had never learned to speak before: gratitude, acknowledgement, humility. Simple, human truths that had eluded her in a lifetime spent behind walls of fear. The domestic worker received them calmly. She did not seek reward, nor recognition, nor influence. Her role had never been transactional. Her impact had always been measured by consistency, integrity, and presence. Sometimes, the greatest influence is invisible in the moment. It cannot be tallied, counted, or announced. Yet its effect is permanent, rippling outward long after the gestures that sparked it have passed. And in that quiet, steady way, the domestic worker had transformed more than a household. She had reshaped a life. She had shown that real power lies not in command, but in the courage to remain human, and the grace to allow others to do the same. Eventually, the domestic worker chose to leave the mansion, not out of conflict, not from disappointment or bitterness. Her journey there had reached its natural conclusion, and she knew her purpose had been fulfilled. The lessons she had imparted, the quiet strength she had modeled, were now woven into the very fabric of the household, and into the heart of the bride herself. On her last day, the bride walked her to the door. It was a gesture no one could have imagined months earlier, when fear had ruled every interaction. There were no dramatic speeches, no tears offered for performance, no grand displays of gratitude. Just silence, dense, meaningful, and full of unspoken understanding. Every step toward that doorway carried the weight of growth, accountability, and transformation. The bride realized something profound. Some people enter your life not to stay forever, but to change you forever. As the door closed behind the domestic worker, a familiar tremor of fear tried to creep back into the bride's chest. The reflex had been honed for years, a warning, a defense. But this time, it dissolved before it could take hold. She no longer needed it. She had learned who she was without it. And in that quiet, unshakable moment, the mansion, once a house of intimidation, had finally become a home of strength, integrity, and freedom. Years later, the story of the once feared bride had transformed into something entirely different. People spoke of her leadership, her fairness, her unexpected humanity. Her reputation no longer relied on whispers of fear or tales of cruelty, but on respect earned through consistency, accountability, and integrity. Few remembered or knew where it had truly begun. In quiet moments, unremarkable at the time, between a woman of wealth and power and a domestic worker whose only currency was resilience. And the domestic worker? She carried that same quiet strength into every place she went. She moved through the world with steady dignity, disciplined presence, and unwavering integrity, never fully aware of the legacy she had left behind. Her influence lingered invisibly, shaping a household, transforming lives, and proving that the smallest gestures can ripple far beyond the moment. Their lives diverged, yet the transformation endured. The mansion remained, not as a monument to authority or intimidation, but as proof that environments change when people change. Its halls no longer echoed with fear, but with purpose, accountability, and the subtle rhythm of trust. Power no longer lived in fear there. It lived in character. And that, ultimately, proved to be the most lasting legacy of all. In the end, the story revealed a truth the world often ignores. Fear may command obedience, but it never earns loyalty. Wealth may create distance, but humility builds bridges. The billionaire's bride had once been feared because she was broken, shaped by betrayal, isolation, and a life that taught her cruelty as a shield. The domestic worker had been overlooked because she appeared simple, ordinary, powerless. Yet together, they demonstrated something profound. No past is too dark to overcome, and no role is too small to matter. Real power is not measured by control over others, nor by wealth, title, or intimidation. Real power is the courage to face yourself, to acknowledge your flaws, and to choose, again and again, to rise above fear. It is the willingness to act with integrity when it is hardest, to lead with humanity when the world expects hardness, and to trust that influence comes from character, not dominance. And in that quiet, transformative truth, legacies are born. Not from fear, not from coercion, not from displays of authority, but from the courage to change, the patience to endure, and the commitment to act with honesty, humility, and heart. In the lives of the bride and the domestic worker, the world saw that true power and true legacy are earned, silently, steadily, and irrevocably, by those who choose to rise above fear.